In the quiet town of Henrietta, Oklahoma, where the red earth stretches endlessly beneath an expansive sky, the spring of 2023 arrived with a deceptive warmth. The dogwood trees were beginning to bloom, their white petals catching the afternoon light like scattered promises of renewal. It was the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their front porches, where Friday night football games drew half the town, and where the local diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. But beneath this veneer of small-town tranquility, a darkness was growing, one that would soon shatter the illusion of safety that communities like Henrietta wrap around themselves like a protective blanket. Holly McFadden was 35 years old, with the kind of natural beauty that turned heads at the grocery store and made other mothers at school pick up wonder if she'd ever been a model. Her auburn hair caught the light in ways that seemed almost cinematic, and her smile had a warmth that could melt even the most guarded heart. But it was her eyes that told the real story, deep green pools that held both fierce maternal love and a vulnerability that she tried desperately to hide from the world. Holly was a mother first and foremost, everything else in her life orbiting around the three teenagers who called her mom. Tiffany was 13, still caught in that delicate space between childhood and adolescence, with her mother's striking features already beginning to emerge from her round, cherubic face. She had an infectious laugh that could fill a room and a curiosity about the world that both delighted and worried her family. At 17, Riley carried herself with the confident grace of someone who knew exactly who she was becoming. She was the responsible one, the peacekeeper, the sister who made sure everyone got home safe after late-night adventures. And then there was Michael, 15 and full of the restless energy that seemed to define teenage boys everywhere. He had a crooked smile that reminded everyone of his mother and a heart so big it sometimes got him into trouble. The children had different biological fathers, but the complexities of modern family life had never dimmed the love that bound them together. In their world, family wasn't defined by blood alone. It was defined by presence, by showing up, by the countless small acts of love that accumulate over time into something unbreakable. Or so they thought. Joe had been that constant presence for 13 years. He wasn't just Tiffany's father. He had become the gravitational center around which this blended family orbited. When he married Holly, Riley was barely walking, her tiny hands reaching up for the man who would become the only father she'd ever really known. Joe was the kind of father who showed up to every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference. He was the one who taught Riley to drive, who helped Michael with his homework, who stayed up all night when Tiffany had the flu. Even after the divorce, his love for these children never wavered. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger, more intentional, as if he were trying to compensate for the upheaval in their lives. The divorce had been difficult, as divorces always are, but Joe and Holly had managed to navigate it with the kind of mature cooperation that put their children's needs first. Joe still came to family barbecues, still took the kids on weekend adventures, still tucked them in at night when they stayed at his place. He had even been talking about officially adopting Michael and Riley, a conversation that filled the house with excited whispers and secret planning sessions about surprise parties and celebration dinners. But then Holly met Jesse McFadden and everything changed. It was May 26, 2022, when Holly walked down the aisle for the second time. The wedding was small, intimate, held in a little chapel with white wooden pews and stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns on the floor. Holly wore a simple white dress that made her look radiant, and Jesse stood at the altar in a dark suit, his smile charming enough to convince everyone present that this was a love story worth celebrating. The children were there, dressed in their best clothes, trying to navigate the complex emotions that came with watching their mother marry someone who wasn't their dad. But Joe was there too, because that's the kind of man he was. The kind who put his children's happiness above his own discomfort. From the outside it looked like a fairy tale. Holly had found love again, the children were gaining a stepfather, and everyone seemed to be adjusting to their new reality with the kind of grace that made their friends envious. Jesse appeared to be everything a single mother could want in a partner. Attentive, charming, successful in his marketing job, and seemingly devoted to Holly and her children. He showed up to school events, helped with homework, and even learned to braid Tiffany's hair when Holly was running late for work. But fairy tales, as anyone who's read the original Brothers Grimm stories knows, often hide darkness beneath their glittering surfaces. Jesse James McFadden had been born in Kansas, and his life had been marked by a series of poor choices that began early and escalated with frightening consistency. He dropped out of school after 9th grade, a decision that set him on a path away from conventional success and toward the kind of life that thrives in the shadows. By the time he was living in McAllister, he'd already had his first brush with the law: underage possession of alcohol, the kind of minor offense that might have been a wake-up call for some but seemed to barely register for Jesse. In 2002, the true nature of Jesse's character began to reveal itself. He admitted to stealing over $80,000 from his own grandfather, a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. This wasn't a desperate act by someone with no other options. This was calculated theft from a family member who had presumably shown him love and trust. Jesse pleaded guilty to the felony charge of grand larceny, but even this consequence didn't seem to penetrate whatever psychological barrier prevented him from understanding the impact of his actions on others. The following year brought more legal troubles: 2 charges for driving with a suspended license, violations that spoke to a fundamental disregard for rules and authority. But these were minor infractions compared to what came next. In 2003, Jesse was charged with attacking a 17-year-old girl at knife point. The details of this crime were horrifying. A young woman, barely more than a child, terrorized by a man whose sexual motivations transformed what might have been a robbery into something far more sinister. The attack was brutal, calculated, and left psychological scars that would never fully heal. Jesse was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, a punishment that should have kept him away from potential victims for decades. Prison, however, didn't reform Jesse McFadden. If anything, it seemed to refine his ability to manipulate and deceive. While incarcerated, he maintained outstanding evaluations for work and education, presenting himself as a model prisoner who had learned from his mistakes and was ready to contribute positively to society. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Jesse was still the same predator who had terrorized a teenage girl with a knife. In 2013, prison officials discovered that Jesse had somehow obtained a cell phone, a serious violation of institutional rules. The phone revealed a pattern of behavior that should have sent chills down the spine of anyone reviewing his case. For 3 months, he had been sending sexually explicit messages to a woman on the outside, using the contraband device to feed the same twisted urges that had landed him in prison in the first place. 3 years later, in 2016, Jesse was caught with another cell phone. This time, the discovery was even more alarming. The phone contained explicit conversations, videos, and photographs involving a 16-year-old girl named Caitlin. The parallels to his original crime were impossible to ignore. Once again, Jesse was targeting a teenage girl, using technology to groom and manipulate her from behind prison walls. It was Caitlin's grandfather who reported the interactions to prison officials, an act of protective courage that may have saved his granddaughter from even worse trauma. According to the Department of Corrections investigators' affidavit, Jesse was accused of sending graphic content to Caitlin and engaging in the kind of manipulative behavior that predators use to control their victims. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern unmistakable, and yet somehow Jesse McFadden was still released from prison in October 2020. The early release was made possible by Jesse's exemplary prison record. The work evaluations, the educational achievements, the carefully maintained facade of rehabilitation that had fooled administrators into believing he deserved a second chance. The cell phone incidents had temporarily cost him the privilege of early release, but not permanently. Somehow, a man who had proven repeatedly that he couldn't be trusted around teenage girls was granted the opportunity to return to society. The conditions of Jesse's release should have provided some protection for potential victims. He was supposed to check in with the sheriff's office every 90 days, a requirement designed to ensure ongoing supervision. He was prohibited from being near places where children congregated, schools, playgrounds, sports events, restrictions that recognized the ongoing danger he posed. But like so many conditions imposed on released offenders, these rules were only as effective as their enforcement, and Jesse McFadden had already proven his willingness to ignore inconvenient regulations. Within months of his release, Jesse was violating the terms of his supervision. He failed to check in as required, ignored the restrictions about being around children, and began the process of insinuating himself into a new victim pool, Holly's family. The case involving Caitlin should have gone to trial quickly, but the wheels of justice moved with frustrating slowness. Years passed as the case wound its way through the legal system, delayed by procedural issues, scheduling conflicts, and the kind of bureaucratic inertia that seems to plague cases involving sex crimes. During this delay, Jesse was free to live his life, to work, to date, and eventually to marry Holly McFadden and become a stepfather to her 3 children. When Holly and Jesse began dating, Joe had been concerned enough to establish a firm rule. Anyone who wanted to be around his children had to pass a background check. It was a reasonable precaution, the kind of protective measure that responsible parents take when introducing new people into their children's lives. Holly assured Joe that Jesse's background check had come back clean, an assurance that would later prove to be either a lie or a tragic misunderstanding that cost 7 people their lives. Meanwhile, Holly's mother, Jeanette Mayo, was growing increasingly uncomfortable with her daughter's new husband. There was something about Jesse that set off alarm bells. His controlling behavior, the way he monitored Holly's movements and dictated who she could see and where she could go. He tracked the children's cell phones when they went out, a level of surveillance that went far beyond normal parental concern and veered into the territory of obsessive control. Jeanette and her husband were the first to discover the truth about Jesse's criminal past. While researching a co-worker's background for unrelated reasons, they stumbled upon Jesse's conviction record. The discovery was shocking. This man who had charmed their daughter and grandchildren was a convicted rapist with a history of targeting teenagers. When they confronted Holly with this information, she initially refused to believe it, so complete was Jesse's hold over her perception of reality. But the evidence was undeniable, and Holly eventually confronted Jesse about his past. His response was as manipulative as everything else about him. He reportedly hired someone to convince Holly that his legal troubles had been a misunderstanding, that he had never actually hurt anyone, that the system had somehow gotten it wrong. It was a masterful piece of gaslighting, designed to exploit Holly's love and trust while simultaneously isolating her from the family members who were trying to protect her. The manipulation worked. Holly found herself caught between her mother's warnings and her husband's explanations, between the evidence of his criminal record and his assurances that he was a changed man. The psychological pressure was enormous. Jeanette later described how Holly seemed to be walking on eggshells, how any attempt to discuss Jesse resulted in Holly being punished through isolation from her children and extended family. To maintain any relationship with her daughter and grandchildren, Jeanette had to accept Jesse's presence in their lives, a devil's bargain that left her feeling helpless and complicit. As the delayed trial date of May 1, 2023 finally approached, the tension in the McFadden household must have been palpable. Jesse's carefully constructed new life was about to be subjected to public scrutiny. The details of his crimes would be laid bare in open court, his manipulation and grooming of teenage girls exposed for everyone, including his wife and stepchildren, to see. For a man who had spent years building a facade of respectability, the approaching trial represented the potential collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. The final weekend of April 2023 began like so many others in the McFadden household. Tiffany had friends coming over for a sleepover, Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer, 2 girls who had become fixtures in the family's social circle. Ivy was 14, with the kind of bright smile that could light up a room and a love for animals that had her volunteering at the local shelter whenever she could. She was her mother Ashley's best friend, the kind of daughter who never forgot to text before and after activities, who always remembered to say, "I love you," at the end of phone calls, who made her parents grateful every day for the gift of her presence in their lives. Brittany was 15, outgoing and vivacious, with dreams of becoming either a teacher or a veterinarian, career aspirations that spoke to her desire to help others and make a positive difference in the world. She had recently been selected as Miss July in a local pageant, part of the larger Miss National pageant system, and her excitement about the opportunity was infectious. Her father Nathan beamed with pride whenever he talked about her accomplishments, her potential, her bright future that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of her. A few other girls had been invited to join the sleepover but had chosen not to come, a decision that would later seem like a miracle of chance, a random twist of fate that saved their lives while condemning their friends to an unthinkable horror. On Saturday afternoon, Jesse picked up Brittany and brought her to the house, where the girls were planning a typical teenage weekend. Shopping at the mall, maybe catching a movie, definitely spending time at Main Event, the popular family entertainment center in Tulsa that offered everything from bowling to arcade games to laser tag. Ivy kept her mother updated throughout the evening via Snapchat, sending the kind of casual photos and messages that had become the digital equivalent of checking in with parents. Everything seemed normal, fun, exactly what a weekend sleepover should be. But Sunday morning brought an ominous shift. Ivy and Brittany's parents received text messages from their daughters saying they were heading to McFadden's family property in McAllister. The messages were brief, lacking the usual warmth and detail that characterized their daughter's communication style. Ashley Webster, in particular, noticed that something felt off about Ivy's text. The wording was different, less personal, missing the small touches that made Ivy's messages distinctly her own. But parents learned to trust their children's growing independence, to resist the urge to helicopter, to give teenagers the space they need to develop their own judgment. Ashley brushed off her concerns, assuming Ivy was just in a hurry or distracted. Monday morning brought a different kind of alarm. None of the children, not Brittany, not Ivy, not Tiffany, not Michael, not Riley, appeared at their bus stops for school. The school bus driver, following his usual route past their homes, saw no signs of the teenagers who were normally waiting with backpacks slung over their shoulders and sleepy Monday morning faces. For parents who were used to the reliable rhythms of their children's routines, this absence was like a klaxon going off in the night. Worried calls began flowing between the families and to the school. When no one could locate any of the 5 teenagers, panic set in with the swift certainty of a summer storm. The parents reported their children as missing to the police, their voices tight with the kind of fear that every parent carries buried deep in their chest. The terror that something has happened to their child, that the world has suddenly revealed its capacity for senseless cruelty. That same Monday morning, Jesse McFadden was supposed to appear in court for his long-delayed trial. The courthouse waited, lawyers checked their watches, and court personnel wondered about the no-show defendant. But Jesse McFadden was nowhere to be found. He had vanished along with the 5 teenagers, and the coincidence was too stark to ignore. Police officers arrived at the McFadden property, a sprawling piece of land in rural Oklahoma where trees provided cover and isolation made screams meaningless. They stood outside, waiting for the warrant that would allow them to search the premises, following the protocols that were meant to protect civil liberties but sometimes seemed to protect the wrong people. When the warrant finally arrived, the officers entered the property with the kind of tactical caution that comes from years of experience with domestic violence calls and missing persons cases. What they found defied their worst fears and challenged their professional ability to compartmentalize horror. 7 bodies were scattered across the property, each one representing a life cut short, dreams unfulfilled, love interrupted by violence. Jesse McFadden was among the dead, a bullet wound to his head suggesting that he had turned the gun on himself after murdering 6 innocent people. Holly lay nearby, 3 gunshot wounds to her head testament to the rage and desperation that had driven her husband to destroy everything he claimed to love. The other victims were found in 2 separate locations on the sprawling property, a detail that spoke to the methodical nature of the murders and suggested that some of the victims may have tried to run, may have had moments of terrible clarity about what was happening before their lives were ended by the man they had trusted. Ivy Webster, 14 years old, who had spent Sunday evening sending cheerful Snapchats to her mother, was gone. Brittany Brewer, 15, who had been looking forward to her pageant appearance and planning her future career helping others, would never see another sunrise. Tiffany McFadden, 13, whose laughter had filled her home and whose friendship had meant everything to Ivy, lay silent in the Oklahoma dirt. Michael Mayo, 15, full of teenage energy and his crooked smile, had been silenced forever. Riley Allen, 17, the responsible older sister who had spent years looking out for her younger siblings, had been unable to protect them or herself from the monster living in their home. All 7 victims had been shot in the head with a 9mm pistol, the clinical precision of the wounds suggesting that Jesse had approached each murder with cold calculation rather than heat-of-the-moment rage. But even more disturbing was the discovery that 2 of the victims, almost certainly Ivy and Brittany, the 2 friends who had come for an innocent sleepover, had been sexually assaulted before they were killed. The revelation added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. These weren't just murders. They were the culmination of Jesse McFadden's lifelong pattern of sexual violence against teenagers. The very crimes that had sent him to prison 20 years earlier had been repeated in his own home, with victims who had trusted him, who had seen him as a father figure, who had believed they were safe under his roof. As investigators began to piece together the timeline of the murders, a chilling picture emerged. The night before his trial was set to begin, Jesse had received messages from Caitlin, the young woman whose accusations had led to the delayed court case. Around 8 p.m. on Sunday evening, Jesse had sent her a Facebook message that revealed the depth of his desperation and the narcissistic rage that characterized his worldview. In his messages, Jesse blamed Caitlin for his predicament, expressing frustration that his life was falling apart because of her refusal to drop the charges. "I did exactly what I promised I would do when I got out," he wrote, as if his ability to hold a job and maintain a facade of normalcy somehow erased his crimes or entitled him to immunity from consequences. "I got a marketing job, made great money, and was advancing. I've been here 2 years now, built a great life like I promised with you. This is all on you for continuing this." The message revealed Jesse's complete inability to accept responsibility for his actions. In his mind, he was the victim, persecuted by a young woman who refused to let him move on from his past, punished by a system that wouldn't allow him to reinvent himself. The murders he would commit hours later were, in his twisted logic, Caitlin's fault for not allowing him to escape the consequences of his crimes. "Now it's all gone," he continued in another message. "I told you I wouldn't go back." These words would prove to be a confession and a threat, a final communication from a man who had decided that if he couldn't have the life he wanted, no one around him would have life at all. Caitlin, who was preparing for what she thought would finally be her day in court after years of delays, initially assumed the messages were about some professional setback. Maybe Jesse had lost his job or faced some other consequence of his past catching up with him. She chose not to respond, instead taking a screenshot and forwarding it to the district attorney as a precaution. It was a decision that may have saved her life. The next morning, Caitlin received a call from the prosecutor with the news that the trial had been delayed again due to an issue with McFadden's phone. 30 minutes later, another call brought more alarming news. There was a missing person report involving McFadden and several teenagers. The reality of her situation hit Caitlin with terrifying clarity. She packed a bag in a hurry and rented an Airbnb 45 minutes away, instinctively understanding that Jesse McFadden might be coming for her next. In the days following the discovery of the bodies, investigators were allowed to examine the McFadden home, and what they found there painted a picture of depravity that defied comprehension. Multiple beds were equipped with restraints and chains, locked into place with the kind of permanent installation that suggested long-term, repeated use. In the kitchen, an island had been fitted with chains and locks, transforming a space meant for family meals into something out of a nightmare. The house was littered with disturbing items that spoke to Jesse's twisted psyche: bondage toys, restraining devices, bottles of lubrication, and books related to witchcraft and the occult. Drug paraphernalia was scattered throughout the rooms, including what appeared to be drugged candy, suggesting that Jesse may have been using substances to incapacitate his victims. The evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for months or possibly years, hidden behind the facade of a normal family life. Among the evidence collected from the scene were computers, cell phones, dirty bed sheets, and other materials that would likely reveal the full scope of Jesse's crimes. The families discovered their daughter's cell phones among the evidence, along with multiple other devices, computers, laptops, and a bloody wet wipe that suggested the cleanup had been hasty and incomplete. Perhaps most chilling of all was a notebook found in the house, filled with names that included the 6 people Jesse had murdered. The implication was horrifying. Had Jesse planned these murders in advance? Had he been keeping a list of potential victims, working his way through names like items on a grocery list? The notebook suggested a level of premeditation that transformed the murders from a heat-of-the-moment decision into something far more sinister. The condition of the house raised obvious questions about what Holly had known about her husband's activities. The restraints, the chains, the disturbing paraphernalia, these weren't items that could be easily hidden or explained away. Either Holly had been complicit in Jesse's crimes, or she had been so thoroughly manipulated and controlled that she was unable to recognize or respond to the dangers surrounding her children. Those who knew Holly believed it was the latter. She had been described by everyone who knew her as a devoted mother who would have died to protect her children, which in the end she did. The manipulation and control that Jeanette had observed suggested that Holly was as much a victim of Jesse's psychological abuse as anyone else. Living under constant surveillance, isolated from family members who tried to warn her, walking on eggshells to maintain access to her own children, Holly's life had become a prison of her husband's construction. The impact of the murders rippled outward from the immediate families to the entire community. Nathan Brewer, Brittany's father, struggled to find words to describe his daughter's vibrant personality and the dreams that would never be fulfilled. She had been excited about her upcoming pageant appearance, proud of being selected as Miss July, looking forward to a future in teaching or veterinary medicine. Now Nathan faced the impossible task of planning a funeral instead of celebrating his daughter's achievements. The questions multiplied but the answers remained elusive. Jesse McFadden had taken his motivations and his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only the evidence of his crimes and the devastated families of his victims. The fairy tale that had begun with Holly's second wedding had ended in the kind of horror that defies comprehension, a reminder that evil often wears the most convincing masks. In small towns like Henrietta, tragedies like this reverberate through generations. The high school hallways that once echoed with Tiffany's laughter now feel haunted by her absence. The softball fields where Ivy played seem empty without her infectious enthusiasm. The classrooms where Riley and Michael should have graduated will forever feel incomplete. Brittany's dreams of becoming a teacher or veterinarian died with her, leaving the world a little less bright for their absence. The families left behind face a grief that has no timeline, no easy resolution, no path back to the way things were before. They carry the weight of what-ifs and if-onlys, the crushing knowledge that the people they loved most were destroyed by someone they had trusted. The healing, if it comes at all, will be measured in decades rather than months, and the scars will never fully fade. For the community of Henrietta, the McFadden murders serve as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most convincing facades, that the people we trust with our most precious relationships can harbor secrets that destroy everything we hold dear. The case stands as a testament to the importance of listening to warning signs, of trusting instincts even when they conflict with what we want to believe, and of remembering that some people are simply too dangerous to be given second chances. But perhaps most importantly, the tragedy reminds us to cherish the time we have with the people we love, to say, "I love you," at the end of phone calls like Ivy always did, to show up for the people who matter like Joe always did, to protect our children with the fierce devotion that Holly died trying to provide. In a world where such senseless violence is possible, love becomes both more precious and more fragile, a flame that we must guard carefully against the darkness that surrounds us all. The story of Jesse McFadden and the 7 lives he destroyed will fade from headlines and news cycles, but it will live on in the hearts of those who knew and loved his victims. Tiffany's laughter, Ivy's kindness, Brittany's dreams, Michael's smile, Riley's protective love, Holly's maternal devotion. These are the things that matter, the light that outlasts the darkness, the love that death cannot diminish. In remembering them not as victims but as the vibrant, loving people they were, we honor their lives and refuse to let their killers' actions define their legacy. The red earth of Oklahoma holds their bodies now, but their spirits live on in the memories of those who loved them, in the lessons their deaths teach us about vigilance and love, in the reminder that even in the face of incomprehensible evil, the human capacity for love and protection endures. They deserved so much more than the hand fate dealt them, but in their brief time on this earth, they gave the world more love and light than many people manage in a full lifetime. That, perhaps, is the only comfort to be found in this tale of betrayal and loss, that love, however briefly lived, is never truly lost.